I'm Scott Beaulier, host of EconVersations and director of the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. On last week's show, we talked about the federal government, what the federal government spends money on, how the federal government is financed in the form of taxes, and kind of general directions and trends with all of that spending. This week we're continuing that conversation about federal spending, about the government, but taking a more long-run view, looking at the big picture and trying to understand where we have been as a country when it comes to expenditures and where we might be going. Our guest this week is George Crowley, Assistant Professor of Economics in the Johnson Center for Political Economy. He's trained in public choice economics, which is the study of government and how government behaves using the tools of economics to understand their behavior. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's get right into it. Last week we had Dan Sutter on the show. He put up a lot of data on expenditures, talked about some of the big categories of spending: Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, interest on the debt, and defense. Those are kind of the big ones. When you add all of those together, it's into the trillions. Is that something, are we in new territory here in the present, or has it taken us quite a while to get to where we are?
Yeah, it has taken us quite a while to get here. I think a lot of people are surprised to see how small the federal government was in the early history of the country. It's only been since essentially the 1940s or so that we've reached the levels of spending that we are currently at, and we truly are at unprecedented levels, even by those standards today.
So we have a slide here, and according to this, the government in 1900 was at the federal level only spending about 3% of gross domestic product, and today that number's around 25%.
Yeah, that's correct. The way to interpret this slide essentially is of all the stuff that's produced in the country, what percentage of that is essentially paid for or consumed by the government. Early 1900s and even going back further than that, the government spending as a percentage of GDP or total national income was only about 3 to 4%. You see there are some peaks during war times, and then but ever since essentially the late 40s, early 50s, it's been this steady incline to about the level we have now of around 25%.
So if we were to go back to the previous century, would that line probably be under 5%? Was
Yes.
the 19th century a period of pretty small government? So this is a recent phenomenon.
It is a very recent phenomenon in the history of the country for sure, and even in the last 100 years or so. Yeah.
When we look at some of these spikes, you see a big spike for World War I, another big spike for World War II, but you come back down after some of those spikes. Is there anything you can say about those periods? Wartime spending, of course, you get big bumps up.
Sure. Yeah. Of course, during war, you'll also see that there's a bit of a rise up during the Great Depression period and the current crisis. During periods of crisis, be it war or financial crisis or something else, you do see these we call them ratchets up in government spending. They're called a ratchet because it's a huge jump, and then as you noted, it does come back down, but it never comes back down to the pre-crisis level. So as I'm sure we'll talk about as going forward here, the problem with this is that a lot of these crisis-type programs tend to persist long after the crisis itself has ended.
Let's look at this next slide that you put together for the show. It translates, if I am understanding it right, it translates all of what we see in the previous slide into dollars per person that's being spent.
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
This is just federal money,
This
right?
is just the federal government spending. We'll have a slide later about state and local spending, but the way to interpret this, as you said, is early 1900s or so, the federal government was spending about $200. These are real dollars, adjusted for inflation. About $200 per person.
So that's in 2011 dollars.
It's this graph here is in 2005 dollars.
Okay.
We've had a bit of inflation
apples to
since
apples,
then, but
essentially. Yeah.
So about $200. You see that per person at the federal level, and you see that there are the spikes again during periods of crisis. But ever since the post-World War II period or so, you've seen this consistent increase in government spending to the point now where the federal government is spending roughly $10,000 per person in 2010.
Wow. It's amazing, and because it's per capita, that means households are spending tens of thousands if it's a big household. If you
Yes.
if you do the math.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
correct.
some are spending more than others,
Yeah,
but
definitely.
the math is pretty depressing when you think of a household of four.
Yeah.
When we look at all this spending, Dan Sutter last week talked about some of the big entitlement programs. Your data supports the idea that much of the spending is driven by what you call transfer payments,
Yeah, definitely.
entitlement programs, and we'll put up a slide here that captures the growth in government.
Right, and the reason that this is a bit troubling to economists is because if there's one thing that the broad range of the profession would agree on, from like the most extreme libertarian economist to the furthest on the left economist, is that the role of government should be defense, or at least the primary role of government should be defense. And if you look through the early history of the country and into the early 1900s, you see that defense spending has made up the massive or large portion of total government spending, up until the 1970s, when these transfer payments, here I have programs, pension programs, Social Security, welfare, and healthcare programs, have really taken off. Government spending on defense has actually fallen and remained relatively constant in recent years, whereas these transfer spending programs have skyrocketed, social programs. Yeah.
So if you look at the very end, in our first slide we said that it's about 25% of GDP that's going to expenditures. Almost 20% of that is transfer payments, the
Yes.
big three,
Yes.
essentially, and then defense spending makes up another 5 or
Yes.
so, and then there's a
And
little
then
bit left
there's-
for discretionary.
Right, exactly.
So when people hammer discretionary spending, things like NASA and some educational spending and things like that, federal highways, that's just a drop in the bucket relative to some of these other categories.
That's definitely correct. I mean, cutting those types of programs would certainly lower government spending. I mean, you can't argue with that. But as far as making any real changes to the size of the federal government, it is a drop in the bucket. Yeah.
Let's get to the theory of it a little bit. There are a lot of people who have different views about why government has gotten big. Some people think it's just a change in culture. Some people think it has something to do with just the increased demands in the 21st century for defense and things. Of course, the data doesn't really support that theory. One theory that you were positing a little bit earlier was this idea of crises and them driving so much of the growth in the 20th century. Can you walk us through how a crisis, the mechanics of a crisis causing a permanent increase in government size?
Sure. So the idea behind this ratchet hypothesis, this idea that government spending and the size, I really should back up and say it's more than just government spending, it's actually the scope of government activity. So yes, they spend more, but they also get involved in an increasing way in the economy in general. That there's a ratchet up in the size of government, broadly defined, during crisis periods. And it's generally accepted by the people as being necessary, and it usually has overwhelming support. The problem comes within after the crisis has passed, be it a war, be it the Great Depression or a current fiscal crisis that we're in. The problem is that after the crisis has passed, these programs don't go away. I have a kind of fun slide here that was in the Wall Street Journal. This is a farmer in Michigan who's a cherry farmer, and this is 2009 that this picture was taken. Here he's standing in his cherry crop that he's had to dump on the side of the road. The reason that he's dumped it on the side of the road is, if you remember back in your grade school textbooks, the pictures of during the Great Depression, people pouring out milk into the gutter because of various price controls put in place to make sure that prices didn't fall too far. These things that were put in place during the Great Depression and seemed like a great idea during the Great Depression are still in place today. And this is an example of that. I mean, we have a man here who is forced to dump his crop because the price of cherries was falling too fast. So that's just one example. Another example would be post 9/11. A lot of people don't realize that, or a lot of people have forgotten that the TSA, the guys that screen us as we get onto planes, was invented essentially just after 9/11, that this agency was put in place, and now we essentially accept it. So these are just types of programs that after a crisis tend to persist and lead to these permanent ratchets up in government spending.
Yeah, I tell my students that TSA to a large extent is providing theater services. It makes us feel very secure in the airport, but essentially you'd have to be pretty crazy to be trying to engage in terror through an airport at this point. But we have all of the leftover resources from them, and they keep getting bigger, in fact, and more invasive. So
Right.
they take on a life of their own almost, as an entity under Homeland Security.
Right, and I mean, the what I always say is if you tried to get on a plane in the year 2000 and were asked to take your shoes off before you went through security, you probably would have been completely baffled as to why this was being asked. So while the government itself is imposing these policies, it really is more than that. It's the idea that the people have learned to accept this, that this is a role of government. This is something that's necessary. We need the government to make us take our shoes off, screen us thoroughly at the airport. We need the government to control prices in agriculture, things like this. So these programs persist, not just because they're put in place in the first place and never taken off the books, but they're essentially allowed to persist because the people have learned to accept this as a role of government that's necessary.
Not only have the people accepted it, but you get all of these competing agencies that cause a lot of confusion and overlap and redundancy. You have a slide here that's a picture of tell us what this is.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite pictures. This is actually a picture taken by a professor at West Virginia University named Russ Sobel of a gas station in rural West Virginia somewhere. This is just this translates everywhere. It's not just a West Virginia issue that you will see these business licenses. I think there are 13 in total on these two pictures, put up in something as simple as a gas station. Russ always likes to comment that he wanted to make sure that people were aware that they're not performing open heart surgery in this gas station. This is just a gas station. But what ends up happening is when a crisis occurs and these various bureaucracies are created, you're essentially creating a constituency of people that then thrive on the bureaucracy itself. So you end up creating all of these agencies. Each one has an incentive to make themselves as important as possible so their budgets don't get cut. And you end up with really serious overlap of regulations to the point that to open a small business, you have to jump through a variety of hoops.
Yeah. How does ideology and kind of just what's in the hearts of minds of people change after a crisis? I'm thinking here of after 9/11. 9/11 was a failure at the federal level to protect people, essentially. Had we had better intelligence and better politicians and policymakers, they could have potentially blocked that from happening or stopped it. Yet, after 9/11, George Bush's approval ratings were higher than any president has ever enjoyed. They got up to 90%. So what does a crisis do in creating space for politicians to act? And what is there data on people kind of rallying around government after a crisis?
Well, I mean, I think the best data for that would be what you just noted, that approval ratings tend to skyrocket after national crises. You see this kind of rallying around the flag and rallying around the elected officials. To some extent, you're right. It was a failure on the federal government to perform its basic function of protecting the people. That said, people were probably driven to the idea that, well, we need to give them more power. We need to give them a greater opportunity to protect us in the future going forward. So the ideology does tend to shift after a crisis because this happened after the Great Depression as well. I mean, you see the Great Depression is still taught to this day as a failure of capitalism, that the government had to step in to save us, essentially, from the capitalists. And that mentality sticks with us. The ideology comes around that when times get better, as they tend to do, it must have been because of the large government intervention. Therefore, we must kind of learn to live with it. It becomes an accepted role of the state.
Happened again after 2008, of course, with the financial crisis, and people thinking it was just a lack of, it was capitalists who caused the crisis. It was a lack of intervention and a lack of quick action that's causing it to perpetuate. And I think that story kind of persists. I want to shift gears a little bit here and ask you what's happening at the state and local level. So we see all this growth at the federal level. Is there any good news at the state level and local level when it comes to government spending over time?
Well, traditionally, and again, this is a number that tends to shock people, is throughout the early history of the country into the early 1900s or so, state and local spending on a per capita basis was actually larger than federal spending. Not by much, but it was. The predominant number of services were actually paid for by state and local governments. That has changed in recent years, and we see that federal spending now trumps state and local spending. Both are actually skyrocketing at almost the same rate, however, in recent years. So as far as if there's better news at the state and local level, you can't really see it in the data, at least.
So this graph here is federal spending and state and local spending. So when you look at like the burden on the average household, combined federal and state spending per capita adds up to, you would add these two numbers together,
Yeah, that's
10,000
correct.
plus 8,000, and it's about $18,000 per
Yeah.
person,
Yes.
which sounds right. If you think about the average American makes 45,000 or so, they're paying 18,000 in state, local, and federal taxes. Those numbers sound
More or
like
less,
they're in
yeah.
the ballpark. Yeah, okay. And over time, like you said, the rate has been skyrocketing.
Yes, and again, I want to make sure that one thing is made obvious, and that's this idea that this is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, if you go back to the founding of the country, and you know, we're looking at over 200 years now, and this is a relatively recent phenomenon. This idea of skyrocketing and ever increasing government spending in general.
When you look at this chart and you see some significant you see a little bit of divergence right at the end there, but a pretty big gap between the federal and state. How are like federal grants playing into this? The expenditures by the federal government to a state, which then has to spend the money. So like after 2008, there was federal stimulus money that went to different states and probably affected their spending. If we looked at that, has federal programs supporting states grown as well?
Yeah, the federal aid to states, grants to states, which again is essentially just federal money that's then given to states, and states have to spend it essentially. That phenomenon has also skyrocketed in recent years. It's a major part of the recent stimulus packages have been in the form of federal aid to states. Unfortunately, some of my own research on this shows that those programs also tend to persist through time. A quick example would be some of the federal stimulus money was a federal grant to the city of Morgantown, West Virginia, to hire police officers. And the federal funding was available for, I think it was 2 to 3 years, after which time the then city and state of West Virginia would have to, the city of Morgantown and state of West Virginia would have to pick up the tab essentially on these officers or cut them. And as we've talked about, these programs do not typically get cut. So you see that these federal grants to the state level are actually leading to their own types of ratchets in state and local spending, as these programs are not going to go away, essentially.
And here we have your slide of federal aid to state and local governments since 1960. And there you have it. It's another chart with essentially an exponential curve to it.
And again,
going up and up.
and again, it's something that is a relatively recent phenomenon. Certainly in the past 10 years or so, you see that it truly takes off. But even going back to, I mean, there was a little bit of growth in the 70s and 80s, but before then, the idea of the federal government, which again, this is money that's essentially taken from everyone. And then divvied up as the government sees fit. So essentially you're taxing people in Wyoming and paying for programs in Alabama. So it's a very kind of perverse idea of federalism when we think about the typical arguments for federalism is we want the federal government to do things that are federal in scope and state and local governments to provide more of the local public goods. So here we're essentially taking money from one half of the country and giving it to other parts of the country. It's a little bit of an odd idea.
We have a little bit of time left, and I want to get to some big picture questions for you. And I think a nice way of thinking about the big picture is to just look at what's happened to federal deficits over time from 1900 to 2010. One nice thing that was coming with all of these years of low expenditures was also low deficits, essentially a balanced budget for the first 30 years of the 20th century. And today, it was just announced that for the third year in a row, we'll run a deficit over $1 trillion. The U.S. federal deficit this year will be about $1.3 trillion. Is there any hope when you look at this, when you look at the data, when you look at some of those first slides that show that it's just gone onward and upward? Is there any hope that we can get this under control?
Well, the one thing that is at least a little bit optimistic in this slide is that you see that there is not the same ratchet effect in deficits, at least historically. We run deficits during crises. I mean, that is obvious in the data there. But we then tend to run at least modest surpluses afterwards, certainly not a large enough surplus to completely pay off the deficit, the previous deficits. That's why we have a large federal debt. But the caution that needs to be taken with that analysis is that you'll notice the current deficit is historically unprecedented.
Huge,
We have never, I mean, even during World War II, this is, again, real numbers. So this is apples to apples. Even during World War II, we have not run a deficit anywhere near the levels that we currently are running.
And you could say about World War II that it was a time where if you ever, again, getting back to your point about defense, if you ever were going to run a deficit, fighting for the Western world is a time where maybe it makes sense to run a pretty big deficit. Today, we're spending because we've been spending for a long time, essentially.
Right. As far as some of the previous slides we've looked at, the idea that government spending will ever come back down to its even, levels in the 90s, let alone the levels in the early 1900s, that idea unfortunately seems a bit far-fetched. With that said, we have unsustainable debt levels, we have a growing deficit, and we have a lot of people that are actually very angry at the government. So it seems like something will have to give. I'm very pessimistic that we will ever return to any kind of sanity as far as the level of the size of the federal government.
Since you mentioned people getting angry and something having to give, is there much hope for it in politics for change? Let's say that the next year continues to be a year with low job growth, frustration with what's happening in Washington, D.C., and people vote the bums out. And you get a widespread takeover of the House and Senate by Republicans. Maybe we get a Republican president as well. Does that in and of itself guarantee that maybe these problems can be fixed if we just change direction with who's in office?
In my personal opinion, no. A lot of people are very frustrated with the current state of the government, the very bitter partisanship, and the fact that very little is actually getting done. Personally, I enjoy seeing a divided government because when you look at the data and you see that the government is not going to constrain itself, it does not happen. The government will grow, as we've seen. The less a government is actually able to get done seems to be the best we can actually hope for at the moment. And I mean, if you look through the data, it's not a partisan issue. Government growth has occurred essentially unimpeded for the last 50 or so years. We have not had a Democrat president for the last 50 years. We've had a variety of Democrats and Republicans, and there's been no real change in the overall growth of government. So as far as a Republican takeover having any real effect, I'm not sold on that idea. I would personally like to have a divided government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up a good point. You think about some of the big spenders, and actually Ronald Reagan had a horrible record when you look at spending. George W. Bush had a united government. He had the House and Senate who were both Republican, and felt like he had a mandate. Mm-hmm. And instead of using the mandate to constrain government spending, he spent like crazy, doubling the debt in 4 years, I think, or doubling the debt in 8 years for sure. And then the trend is just set to continue under President Obama. So this idea that gridlock might be good is really kind of novel and interesting. If change and if constraining government growth, not even cutting government growth, can't come out of politics, is there any hope for the Constitution or like a return to an appreciation for the founders and their project? We had 150 years, it looks like in the data, of keeping the genie in the bottle. Could we get there somehow through a constitutional reform of some kind, or like just saying that these 10 amendments really matter again?
Right. A lot of people look at the Constitution and say that set up the federal government. What many people seem to not realize is that, and more importantly, the Constitution is there to tell us the limited things the federal government should be allowed to do. All right, you can look through history. There was a famous Supreme Court case, Munn versus Illinois, in the late 1800s, where it is essentially the first Supreme Court case that says the federal government has the constitutional authority to regulate industry, okay, beyond what the Commerce Clause actually explicitly says. So there has been this kind of erosion of the Constitution. Are we better off with a Constitution than if we didn't have one? Clearly, yes. That's essentially why we all allow the erosion to continue, because we know we're better off than with a completely unconstrained government. That said, there are probably at least 2 amendments to the Constitution that would probably help constrain government in the future, and that would be a balanced budget amendment, a actual balanced budget amendment with teeth that says you have to spend, you can only spend as much as you actually bring in so that the deficit doesn't increase, or a line item veto amendment that would allow the executive to get around some of the pork projects that typically get bundled into these large spending bills, that we don't have this kind of redistribution from one state to the next just because a senator happens to have the ability to get it into the spending bill.
Balanced budget amendments are very popular at the state level, and almost every state, maybe every state, has one in their constitution. There might be. I think they basically
there are
have
a couple.
to, right?
There are a couple that do not have an explicit one, but yes, the vast majority do.
Seems like it'd be a really tough thing to get Congress to do, right? Because you're tying your own hands,
Yes.
in essence, if you were to have a balanced budget.
Yeah, that's true. The balanced budget amendment at the federal level has come up a couple times and has never actually gained a lot of momentum because of that exact issue. You're essentially asking the government to constrain itself, which is never a popular thing.
We're just about out of time here. Just a kind of a last quick question. When you look at the data and you look at the trend line, you can't help but be pessimistic overall. Is that kind of your attitude about the next 10 or 15 years when you look at the scope of these entitlement programs, the how big government has gotten? Is your sense that we're just headed towards Europe in terms of size, or can we at least stabilize that trend line some?
I think the idea of stabilizing the trend line is a lot more realistic than ever saying we will see a real shrink in government. And I also, while I'm pessimistic about the size of the programs and the fact that entitlement programs in particular are just going to, the burden of those is just going to increase. I'm also optimistic that that's not actually something that's sustainable. The government cannot do that. I mean, we will eventually have serious problems of carrying a federal debt of that size. So essentially, I think we're going to see at the federal level them being forced to act into something. What that looks like, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't say I'm overly pessimistic, but I'm not optimistic.
Well, thank you. It was great having you on the show. John Allison, by the way, said that mathematically you can't continue with these programs a couple of weeks ago, so it has to change simply because of the arithmetic.
Right.
You know. Next week we're going to have our Dean, Judson Edwards, on the show, and very much look forward to that. I thank you all for tuning in this week, and please tune in again next week.